Hello again.
Hey.
So, slight correction, this is not Barbara, and she's not from Hardware Club, but I guess I won't introduce myself because most of you have seen me, but I'll do a quick one. But Viola, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hello everyone again. This is the second opportunity I've had to come and sit with you. I'm Viola Llewellyn. I'm the co-founder of Ovamba Solutions and the president. We are an African-focused fintech innovator with offices in Maryland, in Washington, D.C., Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritius, India, and South Africa. Our focus is to help SMEs grow with clever, innovative technology. And today I'm here sitting with you in a totally different disguise, talking about science fiction and how it blurs the lines and relates to the reality of tech innovation. Is that about right?
That's right. Perfect. And for those who weren't there before, I'm Raph. I'm the CEO of Startupbootcamp IoT Accelerator program based in London. And we, tech entrepreneurs, we help them get to market. Okay, Viola, we had a good chat yesterday.
It was the best.
About the blurred line between science fiction, science, and our current world of technology. So we'll try to replicate a little bit of that for you guys in an intelligible way. By the way, a disclaimer, this was pre-party, so there was a real conversation, not even alcohol involved. It was a real conversation. But we want to be talking a bit about, indeed, as the title says, how do we blur that line between science and fiction? So first part of the conversation is our today's world, reality with fiction. What kind of tools that we see out there, the startup that we see and the reality that we see, how this is kind of a blurry for you. Have you seen that?
Yesterday when we were talking, it was obvious that there are a number of ways in which we either purposely or accidentally blur the line. There are people I'm sure you've spoken to who do not know the difference between reality. Today we talked about fake news, for example, or knowing whether or not a solution is going to work, or whether its application exists in the real world, or if it was something that they saw on TV. But in the early days, before technology was moving and hurtling us through space at such a high speed, we had only books upon which to rely, and science was the province of the highly educated and the super class. And we talked about Jules Verne, and you corrected the French pronunciation, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells and all the rest of it. And fast forward to where we are today, and we're living in a world where it's not just TV, radio, movies that give us an idea about what technology is likely to be and how science fiction operates in our world, but even our own experience with how things work. There was a talk earlier today about virtual reality and artificial intelligence, but the assimilation of science fiction into our reality, I think you probably know better than I do, is happening in such an osmotic way that we don't even notice it, do we?
Very true. And so we actually took an example. How many of you know the TV show called Person of Interest?
Oh my gosh, I love that show.
One,
there's somebody in the back.
2, 3. They clearly didn't do a good job at advertising it. It's on Netflix as well, I think, so you should check it out. Basically, that was tackling the issue of a superintelligence and interaction between, digital or the digital world and the real world, with obviously real world implications. So we briefly talk about that, and I think you have a spin on that. Do you want to talk about it?
Oh, absolutely. For me, when I watched Person of Interest, it was the entire premise that you could do scenario development and modeling at such a high speed and then have it cross from an analog to a digital environment and have people actually make decisions and take action on something that is purely circumspect. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen, but we are very much convinced by what comes to us by a non-human delivery. I think it's the world that we live in today. It's purely science fiction. But I'm pretty sure that in some ways there are some real-life applications. And you think about people that do scenario development, use artificial intelligence to be able to come to a conclusion based on algorithm data, inputs, and reactions. And I look at what we do in our office in using sentiment technology in order to figure out someone's likely behavior in and around the decisions that we make in their financial lives. To me, Person of Interest was incredibly pivotal. Because it's possible. I think it is.
It really is. And it's getting even more possible today when you look at the world out there with AI and the voice implication of, any Siri, Google Voice, and other new Alexa sort of
Alexa.
technology. Yeah, it's not there yet. Clearly, there's still a lot of progress to be done, but we're definitely going in that direction, and there's definitely some routes to explore there. Now, we want to go back to that conversation around, how do we also think about ethics? So we'll go to that point in a minute, because I think this is a whole topic in itself, right? But let's finish on that first bit, which is how do you blur that line? Cyborgs is another topic, right, that there is out there. How many of you have in their friends or contacts a real-life cyborg?
I think more importantly, who would know if they did see one? I mean, what does it look like? Remember the days of Doctor Who?
Oh, yeah.
And you had the Daleks.
Yeah. Oh, they're definitely visible. You can know that.
Exactly. And then you go to Star Trek and you've got the Borg, which still frightens the crap out of me, the idea.
Yeah, resistance is futile.
Exactly.
Clearly.
And are cyborgs living amongst us? Can they even like us, according to James Young in the UK? But does anybody here have first-hand experience with a cyborg in any way?
Should we define cyborg? Maybe
I
that'll be
don't know
helping.
if I even know how to anymore. That definition is changing.
Human enhanced by any kind of technology, I would say, would be a start as a definition. But it's not only this, it's a different mentality. And I'm sure this gentleman have an idea about it. Do you want to do it? Do you want to give us an idea? You raise your hands. Do you know what a cyborg
Somebody
is?
say? Please.
You've seen one, okay. How would you define it? He gets his device in him that allows him to send the north. Yeah. So basically, cyborgs are people that enhance themselves, or so they think, by putting sensors, actuators, or any kind of sort of particular sort of smart computing technology in their body, either as implants, and there's all kind of implants, or as external things as well. There's a guy that's known to have his like an antenna, like a little bit like a bug, like coming around him, and actually having an additional eye to see from various different reasons. What he says, and it's hard to sort of actually know if it's true, is connected to his brain and giving extra consciousness. So this is what a cyborg is. Now, this used to be total science fiction. It's not anymore, right? So there's this new movement of people that want to get into that next generation of interactivity with the world through the eye of technology. So that's a topic that is, an interesting one when it comes to getting...
Well, that means that we've been looking at the development of cyborgs in science fiction and TV from the days of the $6 Million Man. Does anybody remember that TV show from the 70s? You do. You seem incredibly young to remember that.
70s, guys, so it's a little bit old now. Early 80s, maybe. Right. I want to skip AI because you've already had a bit of talk of AI on the use of AI and etc. But it's going to be embedded in everything that we do, obviously, and everything that we think about. Now, I love to see also, we had an interesting chat yesterday about where this is all originated from. And we talked about classic science fiction novels, Asimov, right? And you actually had a very good question about, is that only US-based originated, or is there a different type of science fiction inspiring technology today? So, Japanese science fiction, Chinese science fiction, African science fiction mythology into it? What do we want? What do you think?
Since that conversation, I've had an opportunity to really think about this, Raph, and I think that if you go way, way back to mythology, whereby the assumption that there is something superhuman, mythical, and completely outside of the human arena continues to fascinate us as human beings, that there must be some way to supercharge ourselves and to become something bigger than what we already are. I don't think that human beings can avoid the lure of being bigger, better, badder than they are today. Yeah. So when you take a look at, let's take Zeus, for example.
Greek mythology.
Exactly, and he's got his lightning bolt. Or you take Poseidon, and he's got his trident. And they all have something that enhances their skill and ability. You move fast forward, and now we have a really hard time of getting outside of what the United States will export as their idea around these sort of superhuman kind of aspects. And I often wonder, does India have their version of this? Does Africa? And I think that it loops right back to those mythical ideas of something created outside of ourselves yet again. It's a very fascinating subject. I don't think that we'll ever get tired of hearing about it. But superheroes are the new gods, I think, of mythology.
It's a good theme, isn't it? This is the theme of the conference, superheroes. So,
Yeah.
You also think, Egyptians have been methodologically extremely empowered by their gods in general. And then you can, like, if you want to go back to geeky for a second, Stargate.
Osiris and all the rest of it?
Yeah, but Stargate, right? Inspiring, all kind of mythical ideas of new gods through a portal. So blurring science fiction again, not maybe reality, but mythology. And so they had a different view on what science fiction was. Apparently, they were so advanced as a society that they had way before everybody else access to technology. There's all kind of mythology behind that. It'd be interesting to see, from the manufacturing side of the world, which is China today, if actually there was some superhuman-inspired technology that we see evolving. If we take, as an example, or maybe from China, but I'm thinking out loud now, we've seen that time and time again this year, from TechCrunch, CubeTech, and other things. This flying guy, right? The Iron Man kind of guy, right?
Ah, yeah.
Do you remember that? So this is a pure, not even technology-driven solution, it's more of a mechanical-driven solution. But it surfed the wave of, the new superheroes kind of thing.
Yes, and I think we can't really have this conversation without thinking about the psychological side of that, because when you think about science fiction, we often think about the technology, the application of the technology, and we think about where it came from, whether it's that we don't feel satisfied in ourselves as human beings, so we need something bigger to aspire to. But there's also the aspect of the psychology behind this, and yet again, when we were talking about Dark Mirror, is that the name of the TV show? Yeah. And some of the psychological aspects of...
Black Mirror, yeah.
Black Mirror, that's the one. The psychological aspect of science fiction and how it relates to the way we think about ourselves and each other. And I had a conversation with somebody about how human beings are almost their own API to the digital world. Oh, yeah. And also we are maybe the dividing line between digital and analog, and our experience and discussions in and around of it are another offshoot of all of these different things. But the psychology of science fiction and what it does to us, I think it accelerates our ability to be creative. It expands the limits by which we continue to evolve. And just like the conversation that you explained to me yesterday, there's that formula for how much data can be fit onto smaller and smaller pieces of material. I think that there is a direct acceleration in our ability to come up with more and more ideas about how we interpret ourselves across a digital and scientific divide. And that is another form of humanity it still fascinates me.
It's a perfect transition to ethics, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How much technology impacts the world today in a positive way, but also, and that was part of the topic I had talked on stage earlier, but also maybe in a borderline kind of negative way. So what is the ethics view on technology around this? How do we, relate to that virtual world? We took the example of the movie Her yesterday.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You guys have seen that movie, Her? Scarlett Johansson as an AI, an OS, right? An interesting concept of somebody who falls in love with a pure artificial operating system, literally.
Yes. A disembodied operating system that was nothing but voice.
Got to say, quite the voice, obviously, because Scarlett Johansson's got that voice. But it is still a very interesting concept, as in you're blurring the line between the virtual and the reality. How do you manage that sort of transition? What are the barriers to, not necessarily to block, but to ensure there's no dystopian way of the world, literally?
Well, ethics are always, I think, pivot around the protection of rights. And also the provision of a voice and openness to examination. So if we're looking at a future world whereby you've got a bunch of these operating systems that are taking on more and more humanistic features, The question becomes, at what point does somebody create an association for the protection of these disembodied entities? Right. And how does that resolve itself against human beings and their rights? We all know that humans, we fight. We find dividing lines and ways in which to divide ourselves and separate ourselves and define ourselves. But the minute a spaceship falls out the sky, I'm pretty sure that everybody's going to be uniting themselves and aligning themselves along that. What happens when we start to see stories of science fiction whereby it's us against the machines? What was that? There was a movie that had Will Smith and AI.
Oh, yeah.
It was a terrible movie.
It was horrible.
Absolutely bloody awful. Did anybody see that film?
AI.
It was the little boy.
iRobot.
It was crap.
iRobot.
iRobot, that's the one. You know all the movie names, and I only know what happened or didn't happen.
I'm a movie freak.
But ethics will continue to evolve and take up a very large part of legal practice. I can imagine that it will be something that will be produced as an actual degree at university as cyborg ethics or other types of non-human ethics and protection of these things, if we ever do get to that point. But for example, and this is a very sensitive subject, look at the ethics around people that use animation in child porn.
Right.
Once upon a time, science fiction would have said that's just a story from far, far away, but here we are in the present time.
Very much so, yeah.
Or the ethics and the rules that have come around about using the images of individuals in 3D and creating other forms of distortion or wrecking somebody's career or their personality. And there are ethics around that. You could easily say, well, it's not really a person, it's just a story. And somebody was explaining that, ethically speaking, children can go in and buy any book that they want because it's a book, but that same child is not going to be able to watch the movie of that book. But there are ethics that make a complete distinction between turning a page and using a remote control. I'm not sure how that got developed, but this is the effect of science fiction moving into the real life today, I think. I mean, right. What do you think?
No, I totally agree, and that's where the ethics and needs a little bit of forward-thinking way of establishing some rules. Otherwise, it's going to be a crazy world out there.
Yeah, but who creates the rules?
That's a good question. It needs to be inspired by people that are actually living it, I suppose. Yeah. And there's so many examples of that we can look at around the world. But also, if we go back to what we said before, the examples of some of the movies, unfortunately, are depicting quite a bleak future. From Black Mirror was a good one. Altered Carbon is just the new series on Netflix.
I can't wait to see it.
Yeah. You guys heard about this? Altered Carbon is a brand new... It's actually extracted from an amazing set of books. So if you want to read good science fiction book. Altered Carbon is really good. But it's basically this concept of transferring your consciousness into a chip and then basically never dying and electing a skin to transfer it into. So you could become tomorrow a black woman, or the next day a small Chinese, or the next day an infant or whatever. So all kind of different sort of skins being bodies where you can transfer your consciousness and you keep remaining. You keep your memories and everything else, including your training and your skills. So it's both frightening as well as inspiring in a way. And that particular sort of show, inspired by the books, depicts both a really interesting view of how you could sort of go into an eternal life, but also all the consequences that it got and tracks with him, right? Mm-hmm. And we talked about Dollhouse, which is another one. We talked about Westworld, which is another one. We
also talked about the potential of delivering personality-altering technology via either drugs, intravenous use, chip. Yep. And we've been seeing the use of chips, which once upon a time were depicted in science fiction as something by which to control and brand people, take Nazi Auschwitz tattoos and all the rest of it. Speaking of which, have you heard that, I believe it was Motorola, who had been experimenting based on some theory a long time ago that you could create tattoo ink that would have an animated aspect to it that was linked to wearable technology?
Oh, I must have looked at that, yes. Yeah.
And so the delivery of persona-altering drugs or chips is something that people have been thinking about and experimenting for performance enhancement.
I talked on stage earlier about ingestibles.
I heard it.
They are exactly what we're talking about. The impact of that is not even known yet. Now, of course, those particular ingestibles are so far used only for science reason in terms of exploration, diagnostics, and everything. But whatever you can put in there could be having, drug enhancements, or could be, literally attached to one of, your body
Well,
elements.
I think those things, technically you could say, let's take an insulin pump. If a person is hypoglycemic, for example, and you know what it's like when you get an angry headache because you're super, super hungry. If you're wearing telemedical type devices and you can alter your responses based on your blood sugar, your hormonal levels, then I think we may have already arrived at some of this.
Could be, very much so.
Yeah.
So we talked about, blurring the line between science fiction and the reality. As you can see, we're very much there already. We had out of time, so I wanted to conclude on one thing, and that's, the singularity, saying, where are we far from that moment where, those artificial intelligence would actually be smarter than humans, and what will be then that frontier after that? What do you think?
All right, so let's take the common idea that the human brain is the most sophisticated computer in the world, the speed at which it processes, retains information, and all of the different connections that it can make. And then I think it was yourself that was talking about the fact that we have more computing ability in a smartphone than we did in any IBM mainframe at all. I find it very difficult to believe that, considering that learning is exponential, that there is this limit at which we stop. And I also no longer believe that we only use 25% of our brains. I just don't think that we're fully aware of what the rest of it is doing. I don't believe that there will ever be a computer that will ever be smarter than a human being's potential. Unfortunately, there are dummies who live amongst us, and I know it's not the most PC thing to say, but it would be very difficult for me, I know, to imagine a world where the human brain is outstripped.
I love your positive view on the future, and we'll keep it at that for now.
Absolutely.
So guys, thank you very much. It's been a bit of a deconstructed conversation, but I think so many different things can be inspiring in our current world of virtual versus real. If you want to talk more about it, come and find us. We'd be happy to. Thank you.
Or go write your own superhero story or your own science fiction and see whether you can bring it to life. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, guys.